So I am so thrilled to welcome to Author's Corner Daniel Wright, because he has captured, I just think, so many different things about a president that I think is overlooked, Calvin Coolidge. And his book is aptly named Salient Cal's America, Reappraising the Harding and Coolidge Era. And he really dug deep, and he knew there was nothing out there like this. And he's a fan of Coolidge's and thinks that more people need to know about Calvin Coolidge when we're talking about presidents and impact and what the man himself was like. So Daniel, thanks so much for coming on to talk about your book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's start with why you wrote the book. What made you decide to write it? You were already a fan of Coolidge's. You had already written something about Coolidge. What was it that made you go in this direction?
Well, I would say the journey of discovering who he was has been long in the making, from the material that I first encountered of him that presented him in two lights. One as the fellow to just skip over and get past that one. He's a non-entity, he's a waste of time, waste of space even, and just get to the real presidents. And then the other thought of the animus that comes out, this venom against, he was wrong, he was mistaken, sorely misguided, and he was high priest of business, and all of the catchphrases that then should just draw forth emotional hatred and enmity for this figure. And so going under those layers, then it becomes more and more a case of, in his own words and in his own way, as you discover what he did say and did do, then he gets better and better. And he's not what they've portrayed that he is, as this caricature that's easy to knock down or to sidestep and get around.
What was, of all, you did so much different research, and we'll talk about that, but of all the things you pulled out of the research, give us one nugget of something that was really interesting that you pulled out.
I would say how omnipresent he could be culturally in using the technology that's just coming into being at the time effectively. He was not out of step with where the culture is taking the presidency, and where he then can use it for good results, good ends, not just to gain a vote. He's not just manipulative. He's much more than that. He's seeing there's a wholesome goodness that continues to go with innovation, and you allow people to innovate. They will then have always that temptation to take it into their own self-interest and their own selfish ambitions. But what we do with the things that are around us can then have great power for what is right and good and decent. And so to be a decent person and not get lost or dehumanized in the things that we're accumulating in very rapid fashion in the 1920s, making the modern world what it is in many ways.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, the interactions he had with people. You told me about a story off the air that I thought was fascinating, that I think let's share this with the people who are watching it, and hopefully they share it with other people too, because I was so surprised with this. I never had heard so much about his humor. And you talk about that's a little bit of an element that certainly resided in him. There was a British traveler, a writer that came through. Tell us that story.
Certainly. So in the late 20s, there was a British pundit, an author. He wrote a variety of humorous. He was a humorist like Will Rogers was for the United States and so forth. And he travels. He's going to go see the president because he's in Washington and on an American tour. So he's going to write about the Yanks for his British readers and audience. And he has already well versed in who Coolidge is and what he what's said about him, so his reputation, he's probably going to have a really tough visit, because getting 2 words out of him is a real chore. There's the old story of him being challenged or dared to say more than 2 words at a dinner party, and he says, "You lose." That's, of course, the quintessential comic retort for Coolidge, but he's doing much more in this visit than the British visitor had ever thought. He goes in, and one of the recurring instances in this visit is the president's chair keeps squeaking, and he's trying to guide the conversation to a serious point and really see how deep is this president, or is he just a vapid politician. And then there'd be that squeak and a comical timing to it, and he'd get to a point and then squeak again, and it's, he's doing this on purpose. He's pranking to see how I'm going to stay on and keep my composure, stay on task, and still keep this interview going. He never thought. And when it turns to something that is testing how profound or deep a thinker he is, he's concerned about, like many are at the time, the 20s youth, and where's America gonna go? Is it over here? Is the experiment done? Is the solidity and the continuity of the young people of America going to be enough to keep the Republic alive? And Coolidge takes it in an interesting direction that this author and visitor had never thought. He saw in the art of the nations of the world a reflection of the health and wholesomeness, well-being, the soundness of those nations, a reflection of how grounded they are, and perhaps how adrift or lost they are in the art. And so he saw that as a reflection of, we don't have to worry too much about the American youth. They're going to be fine. And speaking from a father of 2 teenage boys, he certainly had firsthand experience with that.
I love that story. So when you did the research for this, I mean, you researched his words, because you said there was no book out there like it. So you wanted to make that book. That's a daunting task. What was that like?
Oh, it was a journey of its own. There's the journey to discover Coolidge, and then there's the journey of, once you hit upon enough material and see what's not said about him, then you want to write that book that you would want to read. And so having the journey not just be among documents and books and his speeches, for being silent, he has 4 collections of writing. We could actually say more. There's 3 speech books. There is a daily article he wrote after the presidency for a year. There are of course, all of the presidential material. Some of that is in the speech books. The first collection of speeches he gave in the governor years, Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts and Governor of Massachusetts, he wrote an autobiography at a time. It keys back to his use of how the presidential image is changing, and the memoir being taking a different turn for a president to write a book about himself. It strikes of arrogance. And so for having him key in on that cultural shift in how presidents are using the written and spoken word, and then radio as well, and now we've got the memoir, the presidential book. But taking then that journey myself, finding other folks who were on their own version of the same journey and how they came to Coolidge. So it made so much sense to then try and piece all this together, not as a way of drawing all the light and attention to who's bringing this project together, but as a way of reflecting it as Coolidge himself would have wanted, not on himself, but on others, and trying to then encourage an appreciation, a reappreciation of what he has to say and what he's done, that then should be a part of the conversation again, and helping make that a better conversation, and reconnecting with the principles of being decent, being human to each other, and the things that then shouldn't get lost in the pursuit of, here are the big names, let's just focus on the big crises. And there were no crises apparently in the 20s. They were at the time, but because the way they're handled diffuses so many of them, that gets lost. The problems that didn't happen or become bigger problems, it's easy to then say, well, they weren't problems at all. And that's simply not the way it was, to understand it in its own times.
Yeah.
It needs to be.
Tell us about the impact his wife, Grace, had on his life and even the others around her, because she was a person who people looked to, I think.
Very much. She has a lot of contributions she's bringing, not just to be his support in that corner when he should not be president. He is not a politician of that cut and type, should not go anywhere. How could they possibly get to the presidency and she to first lady? It's just not supposed to happen. You're supposed to be a glad hander, a pat on the back and pose with babies and be this outgoing, gregarious type of person. And he's not gregarious, but he's the opposite of that in reputation. So how is he making this work? And at one point he is asked, what is your hobby or your favorite thing to do? He always has that quick, lightning retort, holding office. He wins every election he ever faces except for one, and that was the school board early in his career. And one of the neighbors in Northampton, Massachusetts, says, well, I didn't vote for you. I said, well, someone did. But nonetheless, his reason, he wanted to know from the school, the voter, why you didn't vote. Not just accept it as, well, that's just your side and this is my side. No, why didn't you vote? I'm curious. He said, well, you didn't have any children. And he said, well, might give me time. I just had married by that time. So let's slow down here, one thing at a time. But that kind of human approachability is worthwhile exploring too. And she was his opposite in that way. The wonderful complement that those two were to each other. She was the outgoing, the individual to soften the tension, to diffuse it where it needed, to then have a very personable manner. And he could then be the persona of, we need to cut here, we have to say no. And that no is also with the thought of the human beings who then are spared the burden of having to pay for the yes if we say yes. So they're both such great human being examples. And I'm recalling to mind how there were a couple of military aides at one point. I just finished a formal dinner, and it's exhausting, these hours and hours of greeting and putting on the public persona. And being, as Grace said at one point, she's I, but not I in those roles. She's having to empty herself to become Grace the First Lady and still be balancing the public and the private together and do so genuinely. But the two aides are walking them up the stairway to the second floor of the White House, and they happen to catch them. That is Grace and Cal doing a very elaborate waltz in the hallway space and bowing exaggeratedly and so forth. And so they were under the impression in their own way that, they had to have been so serious about it, and it had to be certainly exhausting, but they didn't portray in their appearance what was going on inside. And that little glimpse inside was, they're great together, and they're then able to lift out of the seriousness of the moment and reconnect with who they are outside of the public gaze.
Yeah, what a wonderful story. You you teach at a classical academy in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm thinking that some of the kids that you work with, they get to hear some of these great stories. Am I right?
Yes, they do. They do. It's been 5 years with a classical academy, and I've been fortunate to have more than 1 year with some of the same scholars. So I get to say or share more stories than they have heard in any given year. So it doesn't get old or stale, and it's such a joy to then be able to share the humanity behind these individuals, who they're not just, here's a name, here are the terms that they served, and move on. Or here are the big policies they deal with, and then let's go to something else. They are able to then see them as people, more as the people they were when you talk about them as families, as a husband and wife, as they are dealing with human problems that are still just the same for the voter going to work or going to school or having to then fix dinner. They're having to still live and live well. And so it helps to see them in that light, and not just the trivia direction of, here's some cool facts about this president, or here then are the deep policy, heavy matters of state that need to then be understood, the economic issues and so forth. All of that is important, but then having in back of that, who are the human beings who are making the decisions and helping shape them?
Yeah, definitely your book has really enlightened me, and it will enlighten a lot of people too. When we've talked about this, and I think you've weaved it into the conversation, but when anyone reads Salient, Cal's America, what do you hope they take away?
I would say that the cultural significance of Coolidge. He's not just a political success. He certainly mastered the political arena, and did so with a lot of folks saying, I don't know how he did it. I want him to come back and run again. And at one point, when the Depression has unfolded or started to deepen, he has some good friends of his who say, it would be such an end to this Depression if you came back. And without skipping a beat, he says, it would be the beginning of mine. Because at one side, he sees the intense suffering and the loss, and on the other side, he is seeing it takes a whole lot of energy and effort to do this work. Couldn't easily replicate it, as if he just can continue to serve with no erosion of energy or depletion of resources on his part. He understood the value of limits and keeping within those limits. So I would say that his cultural significance, not just as a force of political success or a recipe for here, learn how he ran a campaign, learn how he used radio, learn how he used the cutting edge technology, the photography of the era. He's one of the most photographed recognizably in an instant to folks who lived in that era. And at one point his staff says, I don't think there's a costume he won't put on. I think let's see, because he puts the headdress that's gifted to him in South Dakota. He has the chaps that he gets for his birthday. He's posing everywhere in so many different scenes and occasions. He's using the presidential office in that way, very keenly aware of how culturally it's becoming more and more an important part of what makes the presidency work for the folks of the country. And so his cultural relevance, more than just here's a politician and he deals with economics and foreign affairs and maybe some other things that are legal and dry and dusty, and then move on. He's so much more than that.
And absolutely, like I say, that is very apparent in your book, Salient, Cal's America, Reappraising the Harding and Coolidge Era. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and they can find out more about you. What's your website? Tell us about that.
Yes, so salientcal.com is the site. We've had that since 2013, and It's called The Importance of the Obvious. So it's keying from a statement he made that one day he was going to write, this is in retirement, he was going to write about the importance of the obvious and how important those essentials, those basics, those fundamentals are, and not have them get lost. And so he was seeing Americans losing themselves and losing faith in what had been worth holding on to and building on and innovating from that good foundation of essentials. So we name it for his phrase there to underscore he is important, and the importance that he can have in public conversations, in private conversations as well, to then reintroduce and learn who Coolidge is, and learn both Coolidges and what they brought to leadership in the United States at a time when, only looking back does it seem, how did they do it when it seems there's so many things that could have derailed and gone worse? It's more a question of how did they diffuse so many problems, and not that, well, they were mean and they were like Scrooge, just miserly, holding on to every dollar. And there's so much more to it than that. The stories that flow from it go on over the reason he put such emphasis on the economic saving, the saying no when it needed to be said, was for people. He says this as much in one of his speeches, that he saves, or wants to save, not just dollar amounts. He's doing this with a keen awareness that people are always suffering when you waste. They have to work more to make up for the waste, and the going beyond the limits that you should hold to, because every one of those dollars represents someone having to work for it.
Wow, perfect place to end this. Daniel Wright, thank you so much.
Thank you.